He left me standing at gate C14 with a diaper bag on one shoulder, our 6-week-old daughter asleep against my chest, and a one-way ticket he'd booked in my name without asking. What he didn't know, what he had never once bothered to ask in 4 years of marriage, was that the airline whose logo was stitched into every seat back in that terminal, the one worth $55 billion, belonged to my family. And in exactly 11 days, it was going to belong to me. Stay with me, because what happened after he walked away from that gate is not the story he thinks he's living in. If this story moves you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Let's go back to where it started. My name is Elena Whitmore, though for the 4 years of my marriage, almost nobody called me that. I went by Elena Marsh, my mother's maiden name, because that was the name on the small, unremarkable life I had built for myself in Portland. A life with a 2-bedroom rental, a part-time job managing bookings for a private charter company, and a husband named Adrian who believed, completely and without suspicion, that I came from nothing. I let him believe it. That part matters, so I want to be honest about it from the start. I wasn't hiding a crime. I was hiding a childhood. My grandfather, Harlan Whitmore, built Whitmore Aviation from 3 leased cargo planes in the 1970s into one of the largest commercial airline groups in North America. My mother, his only child, walked away from that world in her 20s after a falling out with him so total that she legally changed our last names, moved us across the country, and never spoke his name in our house again. I grew up knowing the outline of the story: a rich, controlling father, a daughter who wanted a normal life, a rupture that never healed. But I didn't grow up rich. My mother made sure of that. She wanted, more than anything, for me to be a person before I was ever an heiress. So when I met Adrian at 24, working the ticket counter of a regional airline he flew for as a first officer, I didn't tell him my grandfather's name. I told myself I would, eventually, once we were serious. Then we were serious. And I told myself I would once we were married. Then we were married. And somehow the longer the silence lasted, the heavier it became, until it felt less like an omission and more like a wall I didn't know how to knock down without bringing the whole house with it. I want you to understand something about Adrian before I tell you what he did, because this isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about a man who was for a long time exactly who I thought he was: attentive, funny, hardworking, patient with my long hours, and stranger with my quiet insistence that I never wanted to meet his more successful pilot friends for dinner, never wanted to talk about money, never wanted anything more than the simple, modest life we were building together. I thought that simplicity was the whole point. I didn't realize, until much later, that Adrian had started measuring our marriage against a very different scale, and finding it, and me wanting. There's a memory from when I was 9 years old that I've carried with me my whole life, one I never told Adrian about, one I barely told anyone. My mother took me to a small airfield outside Seattle, just the two of us, and we sat on the hood of her car watching planes take off for almost 2 hours without saying much of anything. I asked her eventually why we never visited my grandfather, and she said something I didn't understand until I was much older. Because he taught me that love with conditions isn't love at all, and I refused to let him teach you the same lesson twice. I didn't know then that the planes we were watching belonged, in some distant, complicated way, to our own family. I only knew that my mother's voice went quiet and careful whenever the subject came anywhere near him, the way people get quiet around old wounds that never fully closed. I inherited more from that conversation than I realized at the time. I inherited a reflex, a deep, instinctive caution about ever again being loved for what I could provide instead of who I actually was. It's part of why I never told Adrian the truth. I wanted, more than anything, to know that he chose me the way my mother had once tried to choose an ordinary life for both of us. I just never stopped to consider that hiding the truth from him meant he was never actually choosing me at all, only the version of me I'd let him see. The first sign that something in our marriage was shifting came 8 months before our daughter was born, when Adrian was upgraded to captain and started flying international long-haul routes for a competing airline. He came home from those trips different, sharper around the edges. He started mentioning names I didn't recognize: flight attendants, gate agents, a woman named Priya, who worked in corporate scheduling and who he described, a little too carefully, as just someone who's been showing me the ropes with a new route system. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself pilots and crew develop easy friendships on layovers, the way people do in any profession built on shared schedules and shared exhaustion. I told myself a lot of things, actually, in the months that followed, because the alternative, that my husband was quietly building an entire second life while I grew heavier and slower and more tired carrying our daughter, was too frightening to look at directly. I want you to remember that lie, because it's about to collapse completely. Our daughter, Josephine, was born on a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks before everything I thought I understood about my marriage came apart in a terminal building at 6 in the morning. Adrian was there for the birth. He held her, cried a little, said all the right things. For about 2 weeks, I let myself believe the sharper, distant version of him I'd been noticing had simply been exhaustion, pre-fatherhood nerves, nothing more sinister than that. Then, on a Sunday evening while I was feeding Josephine in the nursery, Adrian's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and a name lit up the screen that I'd only heard him mention twice before. Priya. The message preview, visible for exactly the 2 seconds before the screen went dark again, said something about just a few more weeks until this is finally simple. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid. I want you to notice how much of this story, up to this point, involves me telling myself things to survive the silence, because that pattern is about to break in a terminal building in front of strangers with our newborn daughter strapped to my chest. 11 days before what would become the worst morning of my life, I got a phone call from a number with a Seattle area code, a voice I hadn't heard in almost a decade. "Elena," the woman said. "It's Margaret Voss. I was your grandfather's attorney. I imagine you don't remember me." I remembered her, actually, vaguely, from a handful of stiff, formal holidays before my mother cut ties completely. My chest tightened before she even finished her next sentence. "Your grandfather passed away 6 days ago," she said gently. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this way. There wasn't an easy way to reach you." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, Josephine asleep in the bassinet beside me, and felt something strange and unexpected move through my chest. Not grief exactly, since I'd barely known the man, but a kind of mourning for a relationship that had ended before I was even old enough to understand what I'd lost. "There's something else," Margaret continued, and her voice shifted into something more careful, more deliberate. "Your grandfather restructured his estate 18 months ago, after your mother passed. He left explicit instructions that Whitmore Aviation Group's controlling shares transfer directly to you, structured through a private trust, activating automatically 11 days from today unless you formally decline it." 11 days. I sat there holding the phone, doing math I never expected to be doing, while my husband slept 2 rooms away, utterly unaware that the woman he'd married for her simplicity was 11 days from controlling a $55 billion airline, the same industry he'd spent his entire adult life working inside, at a fraction of the altitude he had no idea I was about to reach. I didn't tell Adrian that night. I told myself I needed time to understand what this meant before I brought it into a marriage that already felt, in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself, like it was quietly ending. I found out exactly how right that instinct was 4 days later. I discovered a folder on our shared home computer, half hidden inside a subfolder labeled Flight Logs, containing months of message threads between Adrian and Priya that made the truth impossible to keep pretending around. They weren't just friends. They had been planning, for the better part of the year, to leave together. Priya had already been offered a corporate scheduling position with a major carrier based overseas, and Adrian had quietly applied for a transfer to fly for the same airline. The messages talked about timing, about once the baby's old enough to travel, about how much easier everything would be once Elena's out of the picture. Once Elena's out of the picture. I read that sentence 4 times before it fully landed, sitting alone in our kitchen at midnight with my daughter asleep upstairs, understanding for the first time that my husband hadn't just fallen into an emotional affair. He had built an entire exit plan around the assumption that I would simply absorb it quietly, the same way I'd absorbed every uncomfortable silence in our marriage for 4 years. I want you to sit with the layers of that discovery, because I certainly had to. I was 11 days from inheriting one of the largest airlines in the country, and I was married to a man who had spent the better part of a year planning to disappear from my life with someone else, using the exact kind of quiet, unspoken deception I had spent years thinking was only my own secret to carry. I didn't confront him with the messages. I wanted to see, first, exactly how far he was willing to go while still pretending everything between us was fine. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, Adrian came home unusually early, unusually warm, and told me he'd booked a family trip, a short getaway to Seattle, just the three of us before he went back to his normal flight rotation. He said it with such convincing tenderness that some small, exhausted part of me almost believed we might actually be repairing something. I packed Josephine's bag. I told myself, one more time, that maybe I was wrong about everything I'd read. We arrived at the airport before sunrise. Adrian was oddly quiet in the car, checking his phone more than usual, glancing at the departures bored the moment we walked in like he was confirming something. I remember thinking, even then, that something about his energy felt rehearsed, like a man walking through a scene he'd practiced instead of one he was actually living. At the gate, he crouched down, kissed Josephine's forehead, and then looked at me with an expression I will never fully forget. Calm, almost relieved, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for a long time. "I booked you a return ticket home," he said. "I'm not getting on this flight with you, Elena. I think you already know that." I stood there in the middle of a crowded terminal, our daughter asleep against my chest, and asked him, as steadily as I could manage, what exactly he meant. "I'm going to Seattle," he said, "but not with you. Priya's meeting me there. I've already put in for the transfer. I didn't want to do this at home, in front of Joe, with all our things around us. I thought this would be easier." Easier. He had chosen a public terminal, surrounded by strangers, specifically because he believed I would be too composed, too quiet, too unwilling to make a scene, to do anything but stand there and absorb it, one final performance of the same silence I've been giving him for 4 years. "How long have you known you were doing this?" I asked him, keeping my voice low enough that the family in the seats beside us wouldn't turn to look. "Long enough," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. The particular gentleness of someone who has convinced himself that being honest at the very end excuses everything dishonest that came before it. I know this is hard to hear, but I think somewhere along the way, we both just stopped choosing this. I didn't want to keep pretending otherwise. "We didn't both stop," I said quietly. "You did. I was still here." He looked down at Josephine for a moment, and for just a second, something like hesitation crossed his face. The first genuine emotion I'd seen from him since we'd walked into that terminal. Then he checked his watch, the way pilots check watches, out of habit more than urgency, and the hesitation passed. "I'll call you when I land," he said, as if that were kindness. "We'll figure out the logistics. I'm not trying to disappear on Joe, just on us. You already have an entire life planned around disappearing," I said. "I've read the messages, Adrian. I know about the transfer, the timeline, all of it. You didn't leave me today. You left months ago. Today's just the first time you bothered to tell me." I looked at him for a long moment, and something inside me, something that had been quietly bending under the weight of every unspoken thing in our marriage, finally, calmly, without a single raised voice, snapped into place. "You're right," I said. "I do already know." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt exactly. More like confusion at how calm I sounded. Like he'd rehearsed this scene for weeks, and I'd just refused to read the part he'd written for me. He turned, adjusted the strap of his carry-on, and walked toward the gate agent without looking back, boarding a flight toward the exact life he and Priya had spent the last year quietly building, leaving me standing at gate C14, holding our 6-week-old daughter and a ticket home I hadn't asked for. I stood there for what felt like a long time after the gate closed, watching the jet bridge retract, feeling Josephine's small, steady breathing against my collarbone, and understanding, with a clarity that almost frightened me, that I was no longer the woman who would spend the next 4 years quietly absorbing whatever version of the story someone else decided to hand me. I want to pause here and tell you what Adrian didn't know yet, because it makes everything that happened over the following 11 days make sense. The airline whose logo was printed on that boarding pass in his hand, the one he was using to fly toward Priya, and the transfer he thought would finally simplify his life was Whitmore Aviation. My airline, the one I was 11 days from formally inheriting. He had just walked onto a plane owned, quite literally, by the wife he'd abandoned in the terminal, believing he was walking toward freedom. I didn't cry in that airport. I called a rideshare, went home, fed Josephine, and sat at my kitchen table with Margaret Voss's business card in front of me. And for the first time since that phone call 11 days earlier, I stopped hesitating. I called her back that same afternoon. I want to accept the trust, I told her. All of it. And I want to understand exactly how much visibility I'm going to have into the airline's current operations, specifically its personnel and route assignments. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me Margaret understood immediately that this wasn't as simple a state question. You're asking about a specific employee, she said. Two, I said. A pilot named Adrian Marsh and a scheduling coordinator named Priya Anand. I believe they were both recently approved for an international transfer. Margaret didn't ask why. She simply said she'd have the personnel file pulled by morning, and something in her voice told me she'd handled enough estate transitions to know exactly what kind of quiet reckoning was coming. The next 7 days were, on the surface, entirely procedural. Signatures, disclosures, board introductions, the slow, bureaucratic machinery of transferring control of a $55 billion company into the hands of a woman most of its executives had never heard of. It was not, however, uncontested. On day 4, Margaret called to warn me that a faction of the board, led by the company's longtime vice chairman, a man named Douglas Renner, who had worked alongside my grandfather for nearly 30 years, intended to formally challenge the succession at the next emergency session. Their argument was simple and, on paper, almost reasonable. I had no operational experience, no public profile within the industry, and no relationship with my grandfather for the better part of 2 decades. Renner's position was that the company should instead be placed under an interim executive trust until a qualified successor could be properly vetted, a phrase that, translated honestly, meant someone other than me. I sat across from Douglas Renner and 11 other board members 3 days later, in a conference room with a view of the exact runway I'd once watched planes take off from as a 9-year-old girl who had no idea any of it would ever belong to her. Renner made his case with the practiced calm of a man who had delivered 100 boardroom arguments before this one. He didn't attack me personally. He didn't need to. He simply laid out, methodically, everything I didn't have: no MBA, no airline operations background, no public track record anyone in that room could point to. When he finished, I didn't argue with a single fact he'd presented. Instead, I opened the folder in front of me and read aloud, calmly, the exact figures for Marcus Feld's irregular transfer approvals over the previous 2 years. The ones my legal team had already begun quietly auditing the moment I'd requested Adrian's personnel file. I watched the color drain slowly from Renner's face as I explained that one of the executives he'd been prepared to trust with an interim mandate had, for 2 years, been signing off on transfers financed by payments that had never once been flagged by anyone currently sitting at that table. I may not have 30 years in this industry, Mr. Renner, I said, closing the folder, but I spent 4 days looking at the same records your team has had access to for years, and I found something none of you noticed. I'm not asking this board to trust me because of my last name. I'm asking you to trust me because I already found the problem you didn't. The vote to formally recognize my succession passed that afternoon, 8-4. Renner didn't resign immediately, but within 6 months, once 2 additional irregularities in his own division surfaced under the new review standards I'd insisted on, he did. Underneath that boardroom victory, though, something else was happening. Once I had formal access to personnel records, I learned that Adrian's transfer and Priya's promotion that was meant to accompany it hadn't simply been approved through normal channels. They had been fast-tracked 6 months ahead of standard review timelines by a regional operations director named Marcus Feld, a man who, according to the compensation records Margaret's team pulled for me, had received a series of unusually generous consulting payments from a private account linked to Priya's family. Marcus, it turned out, had been quietly approving irregular transfers and promotions for over 2 years in exchange for those payments, burying the pattern inside a department large enough that nobody above him had ever thought to look closely. The deeper I dug, the more I understood that Priya's role in all of this wasn't the passive, romantic version of events Adrian probably believed he was living inside. Priya's father owned a mid-sized aviation logistics firm that, for the past 3 years, had been quietly bidding for a lucrative ground-handling contract with Whitmore Aviation Group, a contract that, under my grandfather's final years of declining oversight, had somehow never gone to formal competitive bid. Marcus Feld hadn't just been approving Priya's promotion and Adrian's transfer out of simple corruption for its own sake. He'd been rewarded, in part, for steering that same ground-handling contract quietly toward her father's company, bypassing every review process that should have caught it. Priya, in other words, hadn't simply fallen in love with my husband during long layovers and international routes. She had spent the better part of a year positioning herself for a promotion that was never really about merit, inside a company her own family was simultaneously trying to quietly profit from, and Adrian, utterly unaware of any of it, had simply been convenient. A pilot in the right position, at the right airline, married to a woman Priya and her father assumed had nothing and nobody behind her, which made me, in their eyes, the safest possible person to build an escape plan around. My husband's entire escape plan, the one he'd been building in secret for the better part of a year, had been quietly financed through a corruption scheme. Neither he nor Priya had any idea was propping up the very transfer they thought they'd earned on merit. I sat with that discovery for a long time, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, something closer to the strange, disorienting vertigo of watching two separate betrayals collide into each other without either party realizing it. Adrian had left me for a woman whose entire relationship with him had, quite possibly, been just as strategic and just as hollow as anything he'd accused me of hiding. Neither of them, in the end, had chosen honestly. They had simply chosen each other for reasons that had almost nothing to do with love and everything to do with what each of them assumed the other could provide. On day 9, Adrian called me. His voice, when I answered, had none of the calm composure from the airport. "Elena, something's wrong with my transfer paperwork. HR is saying there's a hold on it. Something about a personnel review. Priya's freaking out. Do you know anything about this?" I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds before I answered. "I know quite a bit about it, actually," I said. "I'm the majority shareholder of Whitmore Aviation Group as of yesterday morning." The silence on his end of the line lasted so long I genuinely thought the call had dropped. "That's not possible," he finally said. "You told me your family didn't have money. You told me your grandfather was some retired guy in Seattle nobody talked to." "I never said any of that," I said quietly. "You assumed it because I let you. Just like I assumed, for 4 years, that you were building a life with me and not quietly building an exit with someone else. Elena, this is insane. You can't hold my career hostage because of something personal." "I'm not holding anything hostage," I said. "I haven't touched your file. What I did was ask for a routine compliance review of every transfer approved in the last 2 years by Marcus Feld. Because when a company changes hands, that's simply standard procedure. It turns out your transfer and Priya's promotion were both flagged for irregularities that had nothing to do with me at all. I want you to sit with that moment, because it's the exact instant Adrian's entire understanding of the last year of his life quietly collapsed. He hadn't earned that transfer through skill or seniority, the way he'd told himself and Priya, and probably me, in some quiet corner of his conscience, that he had. He'd been carried there by a corrupt executive being paid off by his own girlfriend's family. And the wife he'd abandoned at gate C-14 was now the one person with the authority to unravel the whole arrangement. "You did this on purpose," he said, his voice cracking somewhere between anger and panic. "You're punishing me." "No," I said. "I'm running a company honestly," which is apparently more than either of the two of you can say. There was a long pause, and when Adrian spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, more uncertain, like a man realizing the ground under him was a good deal less solid than he believed. "What do you mean, both of us?" "Priya's father," I said. "You might want to ask her about the ground handling contract his company's been bidding on for the past 3 years. I imagine that conversation will be almost as illuminating as the one you and I are having right now." "That's not, she wouldn't have," he started, and then stopped himself. And in that half-finished sentence, I heard the exact sound of a man reconsidering an entire relationship in real time, the same way I imagined he'd once sat in our kitchen reconsidering everything he thought he knew about me. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Adrian," I said, and I meant it, strangely enough. "I'm telling you because you spent 4 years accusing me of hiding who I really was. And it turns out you were about to build an entire new life with someone who was doing exactly the same thing, for reasons that had nothing to do with you at all." He didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and for just a moment I almost felt sorry for him, almost before I remembered gate C14 and the diaper bag, and the ticket he'd booked without asking, and the message that said once Elena's out of the picture like I was a scheduling conflict instead of his wife. "I want to see Josephine," he finally said, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "You can," I said. That part was never in question. "But you're going to see her as her father, not as a man still trying to figure out how much of his old life he gets to keep along with the new one. You don't get both, Adrian. Nobody does." Marcus Feld was terminated within the week once the audit confirmed the pattern of payments, and the 2 years of transfers and promotions he'd approved were placed under full review. Priya's promotion, built on the same compromised foundation, was rescinded, along with the international position that had been the entire point of her and Adrian's plan. Adrian's transfer was voided as well, not out of any personal vendetta on my part, but because it had never legitimately existed to begin with. It had simply been purchased on his behalf by people who had no right to sell it. He called me 9 more times over the following 2 weeks. I answered exactly once, mostly because I needed to say one thing clearly for my own sake as much as his. "You left me at that airport because you thought I was too quiet, too passive, too small a life to be worth staying for," I told him. "You were wrong about almost everything, Adrian. But you weren't wrong that I'd changed. I just didn't change into someone quieter. I changed into someone who stopped hiding." He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in the entire conversation, he was silent, and I hung up before he found one. Priya didn't call at all. I heard through a mutual contact in corporate scheduling, months later, that she and Adrian had lasted less than a season together once the transfer collapsed and the shared fantasy of Seattle disappeared with it. Without the promotion, without the fast-track position her father had quietly arranged for her, there was very little left holding the relationship together beyond the circumstances that had built it. I felt nothing when I heard that news, not vindication, not sadness, just a quiet confirmation of something I'd already understood standing in my kitchen reading those messages for the first time. Whatever they'd had, it had never really been built to survive contact with the truth. Douglas Renner, surprisingly, became something closer to an ally in the years that followed his resignation attempt. 6 months after the board vote, once the second and third irregularities in his own division surfaced, he came to my office unannounced, sat down across from my desk, and told me, without much preamble, that he owed me an apology he hadn't expected to need to give. He said watching me handle the Feld investigation had taught him something about the difference between experience and competence, that 30 years inside an industry can just as easily calcify into blind trust as it can sharpen into wisdom, and that his generation of executives had gotten comfortable assuming the two were the same thing. He stayed on for another year in an advisory capacity before retiring properly, and to this day, he's one of the few people from that boardroom who still calls to check in, not out of obligation, but because something between us actually became honest. I want to tell you what happened in the months after, because the ending of this story isn't really about Adrian at all, or Priya, or Marcus Feld, or even the $55 billion sitting under my name now. It's about what I did with the 11 days that changed everything. I moved back to Seattle, into the house my grandfather had lived in, a house I barely remembered from childhood holidays, and slowly turned it into something that felt like mine instead of his. I spent the first few months in near-constant meetings, learning an industry I'd only ever seen from behind a regional ticket counter, surrounded by board members who had initially treated me like an inconvenience and, slowly, grudgingly, began treating me like someone who read every page of every document before signing it. I didn't fire people out of spite, and I didn't restructure the company to punish anyone connected to Adrian. I simply insisted from the very first board meeting that every promotion, every transfer, every executive decision going forward would be reviewed with the same scrutiny that had exposed Marcus Feld's corruption in the first place. It turned out that kind of scrutiny was long overdue in more departments than just his. 2 additional irregular arrangements surfaced within the first year, unrelated to my marriage entirely, simply because nobody had ever looked that closely before. I established, within my first 6 months, an internal compliance office answering directly to the board instead of to regional operations directors, a structural change my grandfather, for all his brilliance building the airline itself, had apparently never thought to make. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes from rebuilding your life twice in the span of a single year. Once as a mother meeting her daughter for the first time, and once as the reluctant head of an empire she spent her whole childhood being protected from. I don't think I fully understood, in those first disorienting weeks, that both transformations were happening simultaneously, that I was learning to hold Josephine steady in one arm while learning to hold an entire company steady in the other. Some nights, I wasn't sure which one frightened me more. Most nights, by the end, I realized they required the exact same thing: patience, honesty with myself about what I didn't yet know, and the willingness to ask for help without treating it as weakness. Josephine is 14 months old now. She has my grandfather's eyes, according to the one photograph I found of him as a young man, taken decades before the falling out that sent my mother running from this entire world. I keep that photograph on my desk, in an office that used to be his, in a company that is now, against every quiet assumption I once let people make about me, entirely mine to run. Sometimes I imagine bringing her back to that same airfield outside Seattle where my mother once sat with me on the hood of a car, and telling her, when she's old enough to understand, that the 2 hours we spent watching planes take off weren't really about airplanes at all. They were about a woman trying to teach her daughter what it looks like to walk away from something that costs you your dignity, even when it costs you everything else along with it. Adrian sends child support on time. That's the extent of our relationship now, and honestly, that's more than enough. I don't think about Gate C14 with anger anymore, though I won't pretend the memory doesn't still visit me sometimes, usually late at night, usually when Josephine is finally asleep and the house goes quiet in a way that used to feel lonely and now just feels earned. Here's what I understood, standing in that terminal watching my husband walk away toward a life he thought he'd built for himself. Some people leave because they think you have nothing left to offer them. What they don't realize is that walking away from someone rarely reveals what they lost. It reveals what you were never willing to see in the first place. Adrian spent 4 years married to a woman he assumed had nothing, and on the one morning he finally decided she was worth leaving behind, he boarded a plane that belonged to her without ever once looking up to notice whose name was quietly written across the sky he was flying through. I built a life out of the 11 days that were supposed to end mine. And I learned, the hard way, in the middle of a crowded airport terminal, that the people who underestimate you are very rarely paying close enough attention to see what you actually are, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes simply waiting for the moment when silence finally stops being useful to anyone but herself.